I still don't quite get what you mean. What do you mean by utility?
There's one thing every character, and by extension every variant, shares, and that is that they contain some form of utility. Whether they use it with successful results or underwhelming ones, they will all have utility. But what exactly defines it? To summarize, it refers to the capabilities of performing an additional action along regular attacks, in order to either finish off the opponent faster, or in the case of defense to stall out to hopefully time out and reflect damage. Many other cases of utility that don't involve direct offense or defense exist, and every so often they combine with each other in a character's kit or variant's ability. In order to get a good grasp as to what utility refers to, we'll be compiling the most relevant forms of it. This is gonna be a doozy one, but it can also help understand what usually manages to become meta-centric or not. For simplicity's sake, I've decided to compress each form of utility into small packages. That way they can be discussed much faster, while not coming off as redundant. Additionally, I'll see to differentiate whenever it can be applied to offense, defense, or both. With that said, let's get started. When looking at raw offense, there's three possible ways at how to manage it. That would be through attack increase, stuns, and unblockables. All of these share the approach of dealing as much damage as possible, whether by paralyzing the opponent or striking heavy hits in a short amount of time. Attack boosts are the most basic form of dishing out additional damage. There's no real secret as to how they work. You either gain enrage stacks or meet certain conditions for an attack increase to kick in. Alternatively, you can choose to debuff the opponent with Deathmark and Armor Break as to further pierce through their defenses. It's simple and efficient, but it's understandably the least useful under more complex situations, such as confronting a model leader or Tainted Blood Painwheel. Now you mustn't get the wrong impression out of this. Increasing attack can be useful, but it only shows its ugly side should it be the only thing a variant has to offer. If their base kit or ability doesn't feature anything other than boosting attack, they'll rightfully struggle. Armor Break has it a little better independently though, as it helps to take care of armor stacks with ease. This same problem applies to both stun and unblockable hits, making them more complementary assets rather than a tool to heavily focus on. Stun suffers the most, since as long as it lasts, you're not allowed to use specials or blockbusters you already used until it expires. This is one of the reasons as to why people give Cold Stones and Big Bang Skid a lot of shit. Unblockables have it a little better, since they count as the start of a combo if used when the opponent is blocking, and it doesn't restrict your moveset the way stun does. This applies to either moves or abilities with an unblockable property or guard break. Of course, if complemented well, they can become ridiculously busted, the most classic example being the previous iteration of Lobs of Love. As a result, they're often balanced so that they don't snap defenses in half, even though by themselves they can only do so much. Damage per second, or DPS for short, refers to anything that deals percentual damage over time. Many ways of DPS exist in the game, the most common and accessible being Bleed. It's a basic debuff that gradually chips away health, and can speed up a kill if not taken care of, especially if allowed to stack. However, over time it has lost presence, as more countermeasures appear, starting from immunity, ICU Valentines, resistance, and debuff clearing. Still, for a debuff this neutered, it still can provide results. Miasma is the more modern take on offensive DPS. It outclasses Bleed by not suffering from any of its issues, and it provides both recovery and meter control as well. But its drawback is requiring close combat, which is not something that heavily hinders it. That's why more often than not, the variants with access to it either can stack up to 5 or have to meet very specific conditions to do so. Of course, it's not limited exclusively to buffs and debuff. A few will also include unique DPS methods, most well known being Bioexorcist. She functions just like Miasma except for the meter control part. Nowadays she's been heavily outclassed, not only in terms of her dealing damage, but overall speed. But back in the day she was a heavily desirable variant, as Miasma and Piercing didn't exist, so any DPS means were coveted, especially if it didn't activate ICU. Speaking of ICU... Recovery has taken a heavy presence in the metagame. It's always been there as something desirable in Rifts, as it translates to a bigger end score, but it wasn't as prevalent as it is nowadays. By far the most accessible comes in the form of the regeneration buff. It gradually recovers any health lost, altering the speed by how many stacks there are. It's efficient and it helps nail extra points as a result, but being gradual healing along with Miasma and Bioexorcist ability has eventually made it a lesser recovery tool on an offensive perspective. The title has now gone to healing per damage dealt moves and attacks. Take Fuqua and Umbrella for instance, with moves such as Inevitable Snuggle and Tongue Twister. Not only do they dish out noticeable damage, but also heal for a significant amount. But what if you were to take this effect and apply it to every singular hit? Well, you got Leech. This marquee is downright brutal for recovery, easily going from sub 10% to full health in 1 or 2 combos. It's easy to see why Philia is reliable to keep high amounts of health at all times, for she can take a fair share of reflect damage, but not all of it, as we'll eventually see. Another alternative to recovery includes Barrier, which serves as additional health, and it becomes ideal as means of tanking recoil while keeping as much regular health as you possibly can. It's useful on rifts because this way you manage to keep your health score, while the only reflect you suffer comes at the expense of Barrier. On defense, things get tricky. Recovering can help to stall out the match, but exclusively doing that won't get far, and usually needs extra effects. The aforementioned ICU is a concrete example of this, as it activates whenever any debuff is inflicted onto Valentine. This overimposes the heavy regeneration over any bleed, making her immune and even actively seeking bleeds out on the occasion. On a similar basket we have Shitting Meme, we have Splitting Image who can only recover while having less health than the opponent, but she also gains immunity. That makes it so any DPS workarounds become more difficult to pull off, but not outright impossible. Additionally, in both cases, debuff-less brute force can take care of them fine enough. Throws have the unique property of being unable to land critical hits, a seeming negative for the uninitiated, but a blessing for those who know. Some cases happen to bypass blocks, while others you have to go out of your way to use them during a combo, as a finisher or extender. The reason they're valuable comes down to the frequency of reflect damage sources triggered by critical hits. However, as we'll eventually cover with Don't Poke the Viewer, not every throw will have an easy time. Single hits are very likely to activate it due to naturally having a bigger damage output to compensate for its low combo count, which is why multi-hit throws such as Lupine Pummel and Salt Grinder edge out on that matter. Defensively, throws only serve as cheap shots, the unblockable ones anyway. There's a reason why people have the tendency to equip snake bites with 2 or more wolf shoots and place them on a prize fight defense, just as means of getting an easy defense win. Of course, it's nothing more than just cheap shots, and it isn't supported by the fact that the characters that use them don't have noteworthy defenders, except for maybe Freedom Fighter or Criminal Mind. As a last note, since throws don't have critical hits, oftentimes their characters are complemented through the strategy that is cridless builds, as means of further countering pain wheels. The most common user of both cridless and throw usage is Weekend Warrior, thanks as well to his recovery, debuff control, and overall low damage fit for the job. There are several ways to describe meter control. It can be both applied on offense and defense, it can further speed up your own blockbusters, or reduce the opponent's. Offensively, haste is the biggest go-to for quick meter gain, as it maximizes that stat for as long as the buff lasts. It's simple and very effective at building up your toolset, although alternatives for quick meter building such as Hype Man and Beatbox exist, and they're just as practical, the former even doubling down as support. But if you prefer to fuck with your opponent, disable blockbusters and Wither are right up your alley, with characters like Squiggly and variants such as Claw and Order backing it constantly. Their practicality often comes from preventing the AI using their tier 3 blockbuster, whereas faster meter building aims to ready them, so you can later on land the blockbuster finisher on rifts. This is more useful on single nodes or whenever you may need to use a tier 3 like Catastrophe Cannon Omega. Defensively, there's a few variants that are built around meter control, most often to throw off the player, a notable example being Regally Blonde, even though she doesn't do the best job at it. Instead, that's better seen through the work of catalysts such as Blockbuster and Super Slow-Mo. They both do a good job at preventing the player from getting a finisher bonus and force some sort of counter as a result. Defensive meter gain catalysts are also present, such as Mega Elixir, but they're competitively outclassed since they can't disrupt finishers. Some cases can mix and match all these attributes, such as Windstalker both removing and gaining meter, or Heavy Run building up blockbusters on offense and defense. The one variant that perfectly combines everything is undoubtedly Neuromancer, controlling both her own meter and the opponent's and being effective at it regardless of her position, since she functions through blocked hits. Another way of controlling meter doesn't involve removing it but rather punishing its usage. These often possess conditions that upon blockbuster use they'll either inflict negative effects or take the most direct fashion in removing health. By far the most frequent are Assassin's Creed and the Power Surge debuff, since they're consistently chipping away the health of reckless players. Suffice it to say there's a lot of meter control tactics. In most instances it serves nothing more as a means of insurance, either to prevent the enemy from doing anything or to spam blockbusters more often, but there are cases where you're gonna find use out of it. Stalling is the simplest form of defense, with the sole purpose of wasting as much time as possible, ideally leading to a timeout. There are many ways in which this can be achieved. Recovery, as we covered, does this to a fine degree, but standalone it can become easy to bypass. Armor, on the other hand, is more difficult to get around, for at 5 stacks you won't be dealing any damage. This would render any armor user with max defense as overpowered, and it once used to be that way, but with the passing of time more and more counters have surfaced, the oldest ones being armor break and ultra-violent, and later evolving into curse, buff removal strategies and the piercing stat. Nowadays, armor is still annoying, but if one carries the right tools to get rid of it, it's no big deal. There's also cases of markings that increase defense, such as both Big Band's, Fuqua's Wraith Wrath, and Annie's Blue Shift. They all act as extra defense and are fairly minor, but you also want to carry enough piercing so their effect is further lessened. Other common stall tactics involve the use of buffs such as invincibility, unflinching, and final stand, the former of which isn't as commonly seen due to the buff's obvious absurd effectiveness. Occasionally you may see someone running Invincible Armada as means of forcing buff removal, and it works for what it is. Unflinching is slightly more frequent and impedes the defender from reacting to hits, but this doesn't apply to most throws as well as every blockbuster, and they still take full damage regardless of whether they react or not. Final stand is definitely the more common, thanks to its accessibility and preventing death for as long as it lasts. Both Squiggly and Valentine's Marcus have access to it, but it's also present on 2 popular catalysts, Last Words and Final Fight. This buff forces the player to carry some form of buff counter in case they don't want to waste too much time. Evasion could also double down as a stall, since it can disrupt the player's strategy as the AI will immediately block or counter attack. Outside of buff control, a multi-hit combo character can overcome this, while low combo ones are more likely to struggle. One more way of stall includes revivals. Having the player fight variants for a second time is a good strategy, more so if they carry difficult abilities to get past. Although permanent kill methods have been made more common and accessible, like Catastrophe Cannon Omega or Squiggly's Prestige, but by far the most annoying stall strategy has to be out of luck. Its biggest strength is being completely random. Much like evasion, it can disrupt the player's plan, and at 5 stacks it's at 50% chance of activating. As we all know and loathe, Model Leader has become synonymous with out of luck, and while she has more than just that, it is by far her most infamous asset. A solution, again outside of buff control, would involve unblockables and command grabs, since they naturally cannot be blocked, as well as a lot of airborne play. Sometimes there are variants with abilities that often require special methods of approach, in which more common buffs or debuffs usually cannot get past. Examples include Immoral Fiber and Killjoy. In these cases, an ideal strategy involves getting past their ability without triggering it. Enter Precision and Hex. Precision is an interesting buff that never features a timer, and a stack is removed on hit, unless permanent. They are guaranteed critical hits, and they also ignore ability activations. This is often used against variants that have either on-death abilities or specific health thresholds for an ability to activate. Furthermore, it's effective against Plot Twisted whenever she's paired along with Return to Sender, something that Hex wouldn't approach as proficiently. The most common precision users are Pair Souls running Irid Call and Dragon Brawler, paired with his damage increase on criticals. As for Hex, it's the debuff equivalent of precision, and it has advantages and disadvantages. For one, it's a lot more standard. Having a set duration rather than being tied to hits makes it a lot more consistent. However, because it is a debuff, that means it's affected by resistance, and due to how relevant it may be on certain scenarios, accuracy is desirable on the variant that will inflict it. Likewise, the aforementioned Model Leader and other cases like Rose Tinted and the Into Thin Air Catalyst can remove Hex, so it will need to be placed several times in those cases. Red Velvet is definitely the best Hex user, but other notable current sources include Horde of Darkness and Double Spanked Wagon Drashdown. Over the last couple of years, buff control has become more and more omnipresent in the game as means of disposing of any defenses. It tremendously speeds up a fight as you prevent annoying buffs for either stalling or reflect purposes, and the characters with access to buff control gain instant utility as a result. There are 2 possible paths, prevention and removal. Prevention makes sure the buff never reaches the opponent in the first place, achieved through debuffs such as Curse and variants like Standout and Beast King. It's a strong debuff, but it can be situation dependent. Removal is a lot more common, and it does what it says. It takes away one or more buffs from the opponent, or even converts them like Mean One does. It's a vital tool should Curse either be weakened through resistance or invalidated because of immunity, and a decisive factor for faster fights. Moves such as Drill Tempered and Canopy Bounce are often must-haves for the respective characters, but none of them beat Chaos Banish. It's a special move, therefore its use is rarely punished, and it's guaranteed to remove buffs, including on block hits. a heavily coveted move for every Eliza as a result, although by being a special it doesn't have the privilege of a finisher, whereas Drill Tempered and such win out as final fight counters. One more option includes Slime, acting as a buff-based power surge. Much like Curse, its potential depends on the scenario, but if said scenario is met, it can melt down health bars like nobody's business. It's still being tested and its capabilities are still put on question, but a common agreement is that it should stack. Last, there's the matter of defensive buff control, and the only current tool that's any useful is Curse of Knowledge as a counter for buff-reliant variants or supports. I would like to see in the future a form of defensive buff removal, akin to Rain Shadow Legends but far more oppressive, like a reverse Weekend Warrior that removes all buffs from the player and inflicts Curse, despite likely not being as difficult as it may initially sound. Debuff Control is the yang to Buff Control's yin. Obviously it reverses the focus and aims to stay as clear from debuffs as possible, which can be crucial given some of the debuffs previously mentioned, and much like Buff Control, there's two routes that can be taken in prevention and removal. For the former, immunity is the go-to choice, for it instantly stops any debuffs from being inflicted onto the user. It has its fair share of applications, like avoiding bleed damage, blockbuster disabling, and Hex. Offensively, Perishal is frequently seen using it through her taunt, but popular supports include Sketchy, Surgeon General, and even Blitz and Glamour combined with Inner Pieces. Defensively, Splitting Mimage is the better pick, helped through her regeneration. Dream Band does fine as well, but is comparatively much worse. As for removal, it's much more present on defense, although it can be useful on offense every now and then. Model Eater and Rose Tinted are the primary debuff cleaners, but they have the added benefit of doubling down as supports on that aspect. This means going all in with just debuffs becomes a trickier task since you'll have to inflict X or Y repeatedly. Picture Immoral Fiber and Model on the same node. You hex the former and now you need to finish her off before the 20-second mark passes. Otherwise, Hex will be removed. This is one of the reasons these two variants gain significant foothold. The second one being access to reflect damage. And that segues perfectly to my next point. Undoubtedly, reflect damage is the center of the meta. Its purpose is simple, to strike a certain amount of health back at the player when meeting certain conditions. It's a tried and true formula for success on defense, and has made otherwise mediocre defenders into actually decent recoil walls. Just look at Troublemaker, once a god-awful silver that was gifted reflect damage, and he's now actually good. The oldest face of this utility is Dreadlocks. Since day one she's remained a consistently great defender, even if the meta evolved around her. Currently she's nowhere the behemoth she used to be, regularly countered by Leech Philias and ICU Valentines, but she can still be a threat from time to time. A more contemporary example would be Moral Fiber, who rose to prominence around the time rifts became a thing. Her purpose is to die and deliver a devastating, often lethal, amount of reflect damage that forces a counter should the player want to keep as many points as possible, either in the form of Hex or stacking Barrier as common tactics. But to really drive home the point that reflect damage is the most powerful tool, let me just talk about Biting Cold. Biting Cold is a gold water pain wheel with a lot going for. Starting off, we have her ability allowing her to gain Thorns and Barrier while near a corpse, already adding a layer of reflect with some form of recovery, and making sure the player is positioned well or that they control buffs. Second, there's the Tainted Blood Marquee, ensuring that any critical hit goes punished, with 100% damage dealt back. And she benefits a lot by having considerable base health for Painwheel standards. If you chose Grudge by the way, you fucked it up. And this is only acknowledging her base kit, right? What if we were to act external sources to increase it even further? There's the Frost Armor Catalyst, which automatically turns any water type into both a passable staller and a reflector. It also has a frequent chance of activating, with good duration for the armor, and the effect carries to outside armor sources, so Model Leader support works. But this is about to go even further beyond. Don't poke the viewer. This catalyst is basically, what if Scare Stiff was good? It limits the damage all Painwheels take to 10% maximum, already making multi-hits more favorable. Furthermore, if you land a hit that was to deal more than 10%, you'll suffer 100% recoil. That solidifies the need of a multi-hit even more, and this catalyst alone converts any terrible Painwheel into a competent defender. So having set this stage, and assuming the lofty conditions of 5 stacks of Thorns, that tops at 325% reflect damage. Did I mention this only acknowledges one of Biting Cold's abilities? Regardless, while the total amount of reflex sources is abundant, so are its counters. Once again, multi-hitters or low base attack with access to recovery can do just fine, for Pinwheels working better if critless, and against Thorns and Frost Armor, Buff Control does a good job at keeping them in check. With that said, will Reflect fall off the meta? Most likely not. Consider that despite her age, Dreadlock still manages to result effective. If anything, it will be neutered, but that will be it. Reflect damage isn't leaving anytime soon. Oh yeah, there's also Fetal Resistance. Well... And that ends the journey through the various forms of utility. But it's never a concrete resolution. What makes anything practical to some capacity is whatever works best in the meta, reflect damage taking center stage at the moment. But the game is constantly changing, so not everything is bound to stay the same. At the very least, I hope this was of help to understand better the intricacies of the meta, and that you can make the most of this information. With that, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Whenever that may be.